Okay. At a recent event, I said I was clicking record, and I never actually clicked the record button. So wanted to make sure to, in fact, actually click the record button before kicking us off. Well, so just to quickly begin us out, welcome to everybody joining us this evening. My name is Jonathan Cohen. I'm the policy director with Progressive Mass, and we're delighted to continue this series of what we're calling Spring Forward webinars, doing deeper dives into some of the policy areas that are going on at the State House and things that we would like to see Beacon Hill take action on in the coming months before the legislative session wraps up, and at least in the formal session capacity on July 31st. And just to underscore that point, most like barring some small things, most of what our legislature will do for the rest of the year will happen between now and July 31st. So that means that the rest of April and then May, June, and July need to be pretty busy, and they're actually going to meet the moment and do the things that we need to do. Given the kind of, let's say, terrible, wild, kind of wild world, shit show, whatever you want to call what's going on in DC right now, data privacy as an issue has definitely increased in salience on many people's minds. When we know, and our speaker will go into depth on this, that when we've seen the ways in which big tech companies have been handmaidens to fascism in the US, kind of have been key accomplices for that, and are willing to mine our data for their own profit in ways that can fuel kind of both corporate surveillance and national surveillance that leave every basic rights kind of at risk. So I'm delighted to have joining us this evening Kade Crockford, the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, to talk about what can we do about this? How can we kind of fight to kind of strengthen our privacy rights? Why is that so core for the strength of democracy and for protecting democracy? And how can we make sure that Beacon Hill actually does meet the moment and leads on this issue? So, Kate, I'm going to bring you on spotlight, and then Kate's going to present. Feel free, as Kate's presenting, feel free to drop questions in the chat, but we'll do Q&A. We'll do Q&A afterwards.
Okay, great. Can I share my screen?
Yes, you can. Let me give you screen sharing power.
Great. Um,
You are now a co-host and can screen
okay,
share.
great. Slideshow from beginning. Okay. Um, Here we go. Okay, can you guys see that? Cool. So I was actually under the mistaken impression that I had more time than 20 minutes, so I'm gonna have to go
Oh, you can run longer.
Okay, all right. I will try not to drone on too long and yeah, if you
Leave
guys
at
have
least 15 minutes at the end.
definitely. Okay. So I'm going to talk about three things. Um, Consumer data privacy legislation, facial recognition legislation, and legislation that would regulate police use of license plate readers. You may have heard about Flock. It's been in the news a lot. There are other companies as well. We'll get into that. So this is a bunch of words. Really, I just wanted to get this down so that if anybody wanted a copy of this presentation, you could have all this information in one place. I'm not going to read those words. Um, okay. So the first issue is data privacy. When we knew that the Dobbs decision was coming down, we were thinking, okay, here in Massachusetts, we've done a lot of work with our coalition partners to expand and protect abortion rights here. We've done a lot of work to ensure that gender affirming healthcare is protected here and that providers of this necessary healthcare are also protected here. What we did not do is protect the data that people leave behind them when they use cell phones and the internet that can be exploited by bad actors who want to harm them or deny them the opportunity to either provide protected healthcare or to access it in Massachusetts. So we thought, we've been trying to get lawmaker attention in Massachusetts on privacy issues for a long time. I've been doing this work for 15 years and over 15 years, actually. And, in crisis, there's opportunity. And so we thought, let's use this opportunity of Dobbs, this crisis, to try to attract some more energy and attention to this issue that we know has been a problem for a long time, but we haven't been able to get any traction on. So we actually, oh, somebody's in the waiting room. Okay. We actually started this campaign by focusing on cell phone location data. This is information that comes from every cell phone in the United States, apps, telecoms, all sorts of companies, companies that process and serve us advertisements on our phones are engaged in a process all the time of sucking up location data, showing where we are physically in the moment, and then selling that data oftentimes to location data brokers who repackage it and then sell it to other people, including the federal government, including actually the Texas Department of Public Safety. We think at the ACLU that the government purchasing cell phone location data is unlawful already because the federal government, the Supreme Court has interpreted the Fourth Amendment to say if police want to access information from your cell phone company showing where you were last week, last month, last year, they have to go to a warrant and get a judge first. That's a case called Carpenter versus the United States. It was an ACLU case. But they've figured out that they can basically get around that warrant requirement by going to these location data brokers and buying the information. And they're not the only ones. Elon Musk can buy data showing every person who was at a No Kings protest. Peter Thiel and other assorted creeps of Silicon Valley can buy and manipulate this information. So that's a huge problem. So we built a coalition, including Progressive Mass, to call on the legislature to ban the sale of cell phone location data. Great. We've gotten some traction. The Senate passed a bill. Well, I skipped ahead. In fact, over the summer, last summer, we got outreach from Senate leadership who told us, we like what you're doing with the Location Shield Act. We want to do more. And my jaw just about hit the floor because you all have probably done work in Massachusetts for a while. I have never in my career been told by a Massachusetts legislative leader, you aren't going far enough. We need to do more. So that was honestly really affirming of our strategy because and I just want to say this because you all are organizers. Our strategy in terms of thinking about the Location Shield Act was it wasn't that we didn't want comprehensive data privacy legislation. We did. That was the ultimate goal. But we knew that these concepts are complicated. There are so many different types of tech companies that are going to be involved in trying to push back and stop us from passing, comprehensive data privacy legislation. Some of the most important concepts, as I'll get into in a second, are not particularly sexy to talk about and don't necessarily resonate with ordinary people or frankly, even with some of our coalition partners. And so it was a strategic choice to opt to focus on location data first because everyone can immediately feel the creep factor of any rich guy anywhere in the world buying information that shows not only where I'm physically sitting, but everywhere I've been with my cell phone. And that's true not just for me, but for everyone I know, for everyone for children, for everyone in our communities. And so we used that issue, which was easy to explain and really grabbed people to build this coalition around data privacy. And then when we heard from Senate leadership that they wanted to do more, we immediately pivoted the coalition. We're like, absolutely, yes, we want to do more too. Because, and this will get to this slide, there are so many other threats out there. This is a big one. Mark Zuckerberg and his Meta Corporation are planning right now to release facial recognition on their so-called smart glasses, their Ray-Ban and Oakley products. This could be an absolute catastrophe if it happens for, frankly, I think women and girls mostly who are going to be targeted by harassment and violence and stalking with this technology. Just imagine you're sitting on the bus, some guy looks at you, can pull up your name and, just immediately find where you work, where you live, all sorts of information about you, come up to you and say your name. Hey, you want to go out sometime? You say, absolutely not. No, thanks. He calls you a bitch. He like starts, just it's so dangerous to imagine all of the ways or rather, it's all of the ways that this could be used against people. It's so dangerous. So unfortunately, right now in Massachusetts, we don't have any law that would prohibit Meta from releasing a facial recognition product on their glasses that would enable any wearer to clock the biometric data of every person they see in public, walking down the street, in the doctor's office, at a church service or at a synagogue, or watching people go into a synagogue or a mosque. We don't have any laws in place that would stop this corporation from doing that. Another example of biometric surveillance that's extremely chilling in my view is what's been going on at Madison Square Garden. The owner of Madison Square Garden, who's also the owner of the Knicks, hope I have Celtics fans out there, is a guy who's a real prick. His name is Jamie Dolan, and he has facial recognition installed at all of the entrances to Madison Square Garden. And we know this because a woman who is herself an attorney a few years ago went to an event at Madison Square Garden. I think it was like a Rockettes event. She was going with her kid. And she was pulled aside at security and told, you cannot enter the garden. You're banned from entering the garden. She said, what the hell are you talking about? And they said, well, we have a facial recognition system and you're on the do not enter list. So it turns out that Jamie Dolan, the owner of Madison Square Garden and the Knicks and lots of other corporations in New York City and beyond, has a list of basically like an enemies list that he has loaded onto his facial recognition software in Madison Square Garden. She was on the list because she works for a law firm that was engaged in litigation against one of his businesses. She is not involved in any of that litigation herself. She simply works for a firm that is on the opposing side of some issue that, his business is involved in. This is the type of insane stuff that we're going to see increasingly if we don't regulate corporate collection of our sensitive data, our personal data. Here's another example. I talked about location data and the importance of protecting our location data because of our health choices. We don't want, the Attorney General in Texas to know who's coming from Texas to a state like Massachusetts to go to Planned Parenthood. But we've also seen in recent months reporting that ICE is buying location data, including tools. This is a really creepy one called WebLock that allows an ICE agent to pull up a map like Google Maps, draw a square on the map, immediately see a bunch of dots that represent cell phones of people who are presently in that physical location, click on one of the dots, and then follow that person as they move in real time. So I don't think I have to explain to you why that is absolutely bone chilling, that, an agency like ICE, which has so profoundly disrespected the rule of law and civil rights and civil liberties for all people in this country, would have access to information like this. It's extremely dangerous. So what do we want? The Senate passed a bill in September that does 2 out of 3 of the things that we are calling for. Number one, it includes very strong data minimization language. This is basically a framework that says companies should only collect and process information that is necessary to provide you the service that you've requested from the company. So don't collect extraneous shit. That's the idea. For so long, we've been living in this, even though we don't even have a consumer privacy law in Massachusetts, other states do, Europe does, and many of those models are following what's called a notice and choice model. That's why when you log on to, when you go to the Guardian website, there's a big pop-up that says, select your privacy choices, and you have to say reject, accept, whatever. We don't think that that's really the right way to do this. We think that the better analogy for data privacy is food safety. When you go to the store, you buy a bottle of milk. Let's just pretend this is pre-RFK, okay? When you go to the store and you buy a bottle of milk, you aren't thinking to yourself, well, I've got to take this home and get out my lab kit and test the milk to see if there's shit in it. You just buy the milk and you take it home and you drink it. because the government has standards in law that require companies that sell milk to ensure that it's safe to drink. We want the same type of approach with respect to data privacy. We want the burden on the company, not on the individual technology user. Had enough of that. So that's what data minimization is. Number two is heightened protection for what we call sensitive data. So this is data like precise geolocation data, biometric data, information about children, information about your religious practices, your healthcare, your health, what kinds of WebMD searches you're doing, things of that nature. We think that there ought to be special rules that apply to those types of data. Number one, there ought to be a complete ban on the commercial sale of those types of data. Number two, there ought to be heightened data minimization requirements, which would say companies can only collect your biometric data if it is strictly necessary to provide you with a requested service. So that would prohibit Mark Zuckerberg's Meta facial recognition glasses from clocking every person on the bus. Because if you don't have a business relationship with Facebook, they can't, collect that data. The third thing that we want is robust enforcement. And this is where we did not get what we wanted on the Senate side. We want to see a private right of action. What is that? It's language that authorizes you as a consumer to sue a company that violates your rights. Why is that so important? Because if we only have attorney general enforcement, which is what the Senate did, we're basically going to see the biggest technology companies like Meta treat the law as a set of suggestions and not as something that they really need to take seriously. Why? Meta makes hundreds of billions of dollars off of our personal information. They are going to probably make a business calculation that paying a fine to the Attorney General of Massachusetts every 5 or 10 or 20 years is a better business decision financially than declining to collect the data that the law prohibits them from collecting. In order to change that calculation to make it hurt enough for them to actually decide to follow the law, we have to let a million lawsuits bloom, right? We have to give ordinary people the right to sue a company like Meta, because if we do have a private right of action, these companies are going to follow the law. They don't want to be in court all the time. They don't want to be paying out huge settlements all the time. That's too big of a risk for them. And we've seen this in Illinois. There's a law called the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois that strictly regulates how companies can collect biometric data. It's enforced with a private right of action, and it works. In other places where privacy laws are only enforced by the Attorney General, it doesn't work as well. So that's what happened in the Senate. What we're calling for in the House is exactly the same. We want to see the same three things on the House side. So the House has been working on legislation. Basically, right now they're doing the budget. What we've heard is that they're going to pass a data privacy bill sometime in mid-May, potentially. What we really need is for folks to call their rep and say, what's the holdup? Like, the Senate did this in September. Let's go. Like, this is an urgent issue. We cannot wait. We cannot see a conference committee getting dragged into August on this. We need to send a strong bill to the governor's desk as soon as possible. The second issue is facial recognition. So we've been working on this for a while. Back in 2019, we launched a campaign to basically bring some control, some democratic control over government use of facial recognition. Why? Because it is incredibly dangerous when it works and when it doesn't, and it doesn't work a lot. This was a recent story just from last week about a woman who spent 5 months in jail. This is this grandma from Tennessee who spent 5 months in a North Dakota jail, a state she had never visited, because the facial recognition system used by North Dakota police wrongfully ID'd her as someone who was engaged in fraud. And U.S. Marshals went to her home in Tennessee and arrested her and put her on a plane and sent her to North Dakota, where she spent 5 months rotting in jail before a defense attorney, got their shit together to put the basic pieces of the puzzle together to get her out. And she's not alone. There are numerous cases. This is a guy named Robert Williams who was an ACLU client. Same thing happened to him. He was wrongfully arrested because of, inaccurate, biased facial recognition technology. We've seen this happen to many Black people. Increasingly, however, as the technology gets more widespread, it's starting to happen to white people too. There was a guy in Reno who was wrongfully arrested after entering a casino and being told that he was on some do not enter list. And we have ICE, right? These are photos of ICE taking pictures of people that are engaged in protest and using a facial recognition app that the federal government now has called Mobile Fortify to identify them and put them on a list. Some of these people have been directly harmed by this surveillance. One woman was told, the ICE agent took a picture of her, said her name, and then said, basically, good luck with TSA PreCheck, and she was removed from TSA PreCheck subsequently. So here's where we are with facial recognition in Massachusetts. We, like I said, did a tremendous amount of work on this. We banned facial recognition in 8 cities and towns across the state, including Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville, and Brookline, and Springfield and Worcester. We passed an initial state law in 2020 in the police reform bill that does some things that are very important. Number one, police now have to get a court order in order to perform a facial recognition search, which is a step in the right direction. But it didn't go as far as we needed to go. There's legislation currently before House and Senate Ways and Means. Here are the bill numbers. And again, if you don't have to write all this down, I'll send everybody all this information that would prohibit police in Massachusetts from using facial recognition to conduct mass surveillance. This sort of dystopian style, stuff that you see in like Minority Report, where you enter someone's name into a computer and then, the system tells you exactly where they are in the city of Boston because they just walked past a surveillance camera. We think that should be totally banned forever, period. If the police want to use facial recognition in individual criminal investigations to try to identify a person who is suspected of a serious crime, that's different. They can go to a judge and get a warrant. We think there ought to be a warrant standard. Right now, there's a lower standard. It's still a court order, but it doesn't require probable cause. And then finally, we think there ought to be due process protections in the law, essentially a requirement that the police notify a criminal defendant that facial recognition was used in their investigation. And we think this will make the police essentially more careful about how they use facial recognition in criminal cases, and therefore lead to, less harm, fewer wrongful arrests. So this is an interesting bill. It's the product of a commission that was created by the legislature in the police reform bill. I served on the commission. There were cops on the commission. There were DAs, other civil rights experts, technology folks. And the recommendations that we made form the basis of what this bill is. The bill actually passed the House 2 sessions ago. It has yet to pass the Senate. So what we've heard from our friends in the House is that they really need to see a commitment from the Senate, or they're not going to do the bill again. So we need the Senate to pass this bill. It would be great if folks could call their senator and say, what's going on with facial recognition? You guys have had this bill for years. This is not controversial. There was a commission. What's the point of having commissions if we're not going to implement their recommendations? Like, let's go. So we need the Senate to pass this facial recognition bill. Then the House will also pass it, and we can, move on with our lives and have, frankly, what I think would be among the best laws, not just in the country, but in the world, on police use of facial recognition specifically. And then the final issue I want to talk to you guys about is license plate readers. This one you're probably familiar with. This has been in the news a lot. We've done a lot of work on it lately with activists, maybe some of you on the call, as well as people across the state. This is not new. Police in Massachusetts and across the country have been using license plate readers to track where we drive for over a decade, close to 2 decades, actually. Essentially, these are cameras that the police either lease from companies or buy. They put them on light poles or other stationary objects, and those cameras take a picture of every car that passes by them. And then they store that photograph alongside information about the car, the license plate number, and then the time and date when the photograph was taken in these databases. There's no law in Massachusetts that regulates how long they can keep this data, what they can use it for, who they can share it with. And in the absence of those protections, we've seen this. Law enforcement in Massachusetts signing up with this company Flock that has a nationwide database model where information collected in one community is often shared, not just with other police in Massachusetts, but with police across the country. And just to be extremely clear about this, this is not data on people who are suspected of crimes, let alone serious crimes. This is you. This is me. This is every person who drives on the road. These cameras are not discriminatory. They capture information about every single car on the road. This is dragnet mass surveillance. And what we've seen is predictable. Even though Flock says repeatedly that ICE does not have direct access to their database, ICE is getting access to the data in the database by calling up their buddies in other agencies and saying, hey, look up this plate for me. This is not speculation. We know it's happening. It's been happening. These are the organizations that we know of in Massachusetts that use Flock. There are other license plate reader providers too, but this is just to give you a sense of the scale. This is really statewide. You're being tracked everywhere you drive on the road. And again, there are no rules about how this information can be used, how long it can be stored, who can access it for what reasons. And here again, we see that, abortion and immigration are two of the, most common ways that information collected for one purpose is being abused and misused for another. So this was police in Texas that queried the Flock database to look for a woman they wanted to investigate because they believed that she had an illegal abortion. Only when the DAs told them, actually, the law doesn't let you go after women for having abortions, did they sort of give up. But that was their intent. That's what they wanted to do. So what do we think needs to happen here? Well, Rep. Owens in the House filed legislation, House 3755, that would prohibit some of the worst practices that we're seeing in Massachusetts with license plate readers. Number one, it would require police to get a warrant to access data from another police department's license plate reader system. So it would completely cut off this data pooling that we see as one of the major problems here. Another thing it would do is it would limit the amount of time that police can retain these records. So, if you haven't done anything wrong, there's no reason why the police should be tracking where you're driving for years at a time. So we think it should be limited to about 2 weeks to give, look, there are a lot of people and probably some on this call who think the cops shouldn't be tracking where we're driving at all. I'm sympathetic to that. We obviously are working within the system in Massachusetts and trying to, put forward legislation that we think has a reasonable chance of passing. So we think 2 weeks in terms of data retention is a reasonable compromise with the police, who of course don't want any regulations at all. So again, what can you do? You can call your state senator and ask them to pass the facial recognition bill. You can call your rep and ask them, what's the holdup on data privacy? Why haven't you guys passed this bill yet? Do I really have to wait until, the Boston Celtics are in the finals in June for me to see this bill pass? Let's not. And then number three, you can ask them while you're on the phone to support the Driver's Privacy Act, House 3755. So that's all I've got. Thank you.
Awesome. Can we get a round of Zoom applause for Kade before we do Q&A? Because that was an amazing, incredibly informative presentation. So I've seen various questions in the chat during this. So let me pull them up. And then so I'll go through the questions that have already happened in the chat. And then afterwards, if you have new questions, drop them in the chat, use the hand raise function. Either one will be fine. One question that I saw a few times early on is, are you able to share the slides?
Yeah, definitely. I can share them. I mean, they're it's like a big file, so I'll have to put it on like Google Drive or something, but I can definitely share them.
Awesome. And then I see a question. How is location data defined? Does it encompass de-identified anonymized data or only when directly linked to an identifiable individual?
Great question. Wow, that sets me up. So, the thing about location data is that it's not possible to anonymize it because even if you don't have a cell phone number attached to the data, if you have a persistent identifier, which they all do, some, advertising ID or something to that effect, that's consistent for the phone, it is trivial to put a name to one of these advertising IDs. And that's for a very simple reason. Where are you every night between midnight and 4 a.m.? Most nights. You're at home.
Mm-hmm.
And that data alone is enough to identify 99% of the population.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that data point combined with information about where you go on a regular basis, whether it's 9 to 5 or 6 to, 12 or whatever, is where you work. And if you have
Mm-hmm.
those two pieces of information, which all of the location data provides, you can identify 100% of the population. And this is not just speculation. There have been studies that show this. In fact, there have been studies that show just like a few pieces of location data can identify a person, but we're talking about millions of pieces of data on every person. So it's actually not possible to anonymize it. So what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
The legislation says we define precise geolocation data as data that can identify someone's location within 1,850 feet. So we're not actually saying that,
Mm-hmm.
companies can't sell information about who's in Boston or who's in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. You know, I actually think that would be pretty sweet, but we're not doing that
Mm-hmm.
because I think we'd really struggle to pass that legislation. What we're doing is saying you can't track me to a building, you can't track me to a neighborhood, you can't
Mm-hmm.
track me to a room in a building, which is what the technology is currently able to do.
Great. And then I see another, I saw a comment in the chat earlier about the importance of getting small businesses to rally in support of data privacy, and about any comments about arguments that you use to state reps who are hearing kind of all of the kind of astroturfing small business lobbying against kind of action on data privacy, action
Yeah, this is a
on data
tough
privacy.
one, honestly. If you
On
guys
data privacy.
if you guys have friends who are small business owners or people who are small business owners who might be interested in getting involved, it would be really helpful because there is this group, as someone in the chat said, called the Connected Commerce Council, which is a Google funded, basically tech front group, big tech front group that is pretty effective at going around to states that are taking data privacy seriously and considering passing legislation and scaring small business owners by providing them with inaccurate information about what the bill would do to their ability to advertise on, things like Instagram and Facebook, and scaring them into contacting lawmakers and asking them not to pass privacy legislation or to substantially weaken it. So we don't believe that any of those claims are accurate. That said, it is difficult when a member gets a phone call from a small business owner or two or three in their community who is saying, please don't do this. You're going to hurt my business. We're already struggling. So it would be tremendously valuable if any of you know small business owners who would be interested in helping. And we have had a couple. Um,
Seeing in the chat, somebody note that an organization they're a part of is using Flock or something like it, and they don't know know what to do about that. That the organization uses it for the sake of community safety. And so what kind of arguments would you recommend using?
I mean, I think we need more information about what exactly is going
Hmm.
on there, but I would say that license plate reader surveillance actually harms safety because the people who have access to that information can use it to manipulate you, to control you. There are a couple of examples of this. The examples that I gave of the harms from license plate reader surveillance are political, basically, ICE, abortion, things like that. There are quotidian harms as well that are not quotidian to the people that are involved. but are more about interpersonal, issues. There have been multiple cases recently of law enforcement officials being criminalized, actually being prosecuted for searching Flock's database to track people they know. So in one case, it was a cop using the database. He queried 180 times his ex-girlfriend's license plate number and also the license plate number of the guy that she was dating. And this is not unusual. Law enforcement officials using their access to surveillance databases, criminal records databases to query information about people they have personal grievances against is extremely common. So, that might be one of the things you could say to this community. You could also say, are we trying to be welcoming to immigrants? Because this is not welcoming to immigrants if we're doing this, right? This makes us a hostile space for immigrants in the year 2026 in the United States. So, sort of depending on the political values and the belief systems of the people that you're engaging with, there are a number of different kind of strategies or talking points that you could use, whether it's like, I don't want some creep who has access to this to be able to track my teenage daughters coming and going, comings and goings, or if it's, somebody who's more of a lefty, you could talk about abortion and immigration and things of that nature.
Awesome. And then there's some great comments in the chat like, thank you, Cade. Cade, you're absolutely amazing. And thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
You guys are
But
sweet.
let me go up to, I see a question about where does Keeley stand on this?
Your guess is as good as mine. Here's what I'll say about that. This is an election year. People are fired up in Massachusetts. You were probably all at the No Kings protest and heard her give what I thought was actually a pretty decent speech. Um, I think she would have a difficult time vetoing any of these bills if they landed on her desk in an election year. But that said, we are not going to rest on our laurels and just assume that because there's an election coming, she would be supportive. If we get to the point where these bills land on her desk, you will be hearing from us. And we will be asking you to please call her and say, sign this.
Awesome. And I see a question in the chat from Josh from Wellesley, who noted that he lives in Wellesley and also volunteers with the ACLU, worked with the ACLU to work on implementing municipal ordinances in our communities to protect migrants. The police chief said that they have one flock camera in town, but that the data is not shared beyond a 300-mile radius. Do you think that that's true?
I don't know, but there's a way that you could find out. And if you want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat and you can find out. But also 300 miles is really a long, like a very significant distance in New England. You're talking about, New Hampshire. You're talking about police departments in New York State. You're talking, which can be a very Republican leaning community, depending on where in New York State you're talking. So again, this issue of ICE getting access to flock data by calling up friendly agencies and saying, hey, can you do a search for me, is not resolved at all by this 300-mile radius issue. The way that I would describe it is like, look, you could level with the police chief and say, chief, don't you have a sort of difficult time on your own managing your own police force? Like, they're human beings. They make mistakes. They commit abuses, misuses of information. How could you conceivably ensure that the data that you're sharing with police departments 300 miles from Wellesley is going to be managed appropriately and won't be misused when those people don't even work for you? You don't even know who they are, right? So it's a fundamental oversight problem that simply cannot be resolved.
Okay, so I see another question in the chat of one, do you have insights about what the holdup is in the Senate around the facial surveillance legislation you were talking about? And are the things that we can be advocating for on the city or a town level while waiting for the state to act on these issues?
Yeah, great questions. Insight on the Senate. I really don't. It's been difficult to get a sense from them of why they haven't passed this bill. The year that the House passed it late in July at the end of the second year of the session. And so what they told us then is like, we don't have time to do this right now. And then, the subsequent session, it's always, it's not the right time. There's other stuff going on. But then the subsequent session was the session where the legislature did almost nothing and got tons of criticism. So you could ask basically, why did they do almost nothing? I don't know. Um, and now we're in the third session where we're trying to get them to act on this bill. So, there have been other priorities. They've, to their credit, they passed the privacy bill in September, in the first year of the session. So that's great. I don't know that there is organized opposition to this legislation, which makes it extra frustrating that we can't get it done. I think it's just that, frankly, they haven't been hearing enough from voters. And so your phone call could really make a big difference.
The question in the chat, what kind of legal accountability do the police have for data and tech that they use? And if it's biased, discriminatory, etc., can they be held accountable and is there a cost to them?
Sorry, what kind of accountability? Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad question. So I think, the answer would depend on specifically what technology, if there was discriminatory impact in the use of the technology, or if the technology were biased itself, like with respect to facial recognition. These are questions that courts are starting to examine. Um, the legal standard for how to prove that, police engaged in racially discriminatory conduct, for example, it's kind of a high bar, honestly, for criminal defendants to pass. But we don't actually think that these issues should exclusively be resolved by the courts, which is unfortunately what has happened in Massachusetts thus far. The legislature really hasn't grappled, with the exception of the facial recognition law that passed in 2020, with a lot of these new technologies. And so that's why we strongly support the license plate reader bill. It is possible that a case could get to the SJC and the SJC would say, this is unconstitutional. In fact, we believe that they probably would. But for a variety of complicated reasons that if you want to nerd out, we can talk about sometime later, that case hasn't reached the SJC and it probably won't. So we need the legislature to step in.
I muted myself. Let me pull up. Okay, so is phone location data collected when the phone's powered off?
Uh, no. In most cases, no. I mean, when Ed Snowden disclosed his NSA files, there was some indication that even in 2013, the NSA had technology that could turn phones into tracking devices, even if they were turned off.
Hmm.
But no, your local police department can't track the phone if it's off, and neither can, Facebook.
It's a good comment from kind of Issa Leshko about how even within Massachusetts, different municipalities have different levels of cooperation with ICE, which is why automatic sharing is problematic. Question earlier that one of the things that really concerns me is how many of these surveillance tech developers share APIs that allow integration with each other. This makes it possible to track how data is being shared. What can be done about this?
Um, So this was a question about, sorry, I was looking at something in the chat. This is a question about APIs. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we are that is exactly the issue that we're trying to take on with the data privacy legislation that would regulate, uh which APIs companies use and what types of data those APIs are siphoning off of
Mhm.
their phone. So yeah, that's precisely the type of issue that we seek to regulate.
Another question, it's very difficult to turn off all location on Apple phones and iPads because some apps require location to be on. What can be done? What can be done about that?
So I'll be honest with you, there's not really much you can do about being tracked. There's evidence that some years back, your telecommunications company was selling your location data. So it doesn't matter if you have location services turned on or off. Um, your location data is probably being sold. Um, that's why we need the legislature to step in, because individuals
Mhm.
just using the settings on our phones cannot protect ourselves.
Going back to the issue around Flock about how even if they limit it to a certain number of miles, the expansive contract language still allows Flock to share the data with law enforcement. Right.
Yep.
And then two questions of one, is there any realistic regulation over so-called de-identified data that is achievable soon when even trying to address the issue of de-identified data? not actually being de-identified in a city contract with ALPR type tech. It was a total non-starter and is a disaster waiting to happen, given a lot of new models are very adept at re-identifying data with even sparse, meager data sets. And a kind of question about limiting purchase of data from the buyer side.
Limiting purchasing from the buyer side is complicated for constitutional reasons. That's why we're trying to limit first party sale of data. That's more straightforward and we believe has an easier path constitutionally. Um, with respect to the question about de-identified data, it really depends on what type of information you're talking about. There are obviously, very advanced ways that data scientists can re-identify a lot of this information, which is why I actually prefer the term pseudonymous data
Hmm.
instead of de-identified data because it really is just data that's waiting for someone to re-identify it in many
Mm-hmm.
cases. So yeah, it's very, situation and fact dependent.
That I love the comment from Susan in the chat about the benefit from an organized kind of lobbying campaign of calling in on a specific day. I will, for those who are able to stay on, that we can take some time to call legislators at the end of this meeting. And I'll also drop in the chat about the lobby day that Progressive Mass has at the State House coming up soon. Uh, I've seen a few questions from people about any one pagers that you have with some of the like specific talking points about these issues as well.
Yeah, so we have information on our website. Let me pull up the page for you that has a bunch of information about all of these bills and in some cases there are places where you can learn more information and there's like talking points and there are also some calls to action on the website. So, we would love for you to call your legislators, but in addition to calling, you can share with, family and friends
Hmm.
these like online calls to action, which
Hmm.
allow people to email as well. But yeah, I'll dig up. You know what? Probably after this, it makes sense for me to just put an email together with a bunch of stuff that John can share with everybody.
Yeah, can do. Yeah, 'cause it's been a lot of amazing resources here. That any other questions that folks have? I saw some hands raised during that I wasn't able to get to. Um, so I just wanted to make the final. Um, Uh, yes, see about it. Well, I see Ashley. I saw that you had a question before. Uh, yeah, that's honestly a good question about Wegmans putting facial data into a proprietary data set. Uh, Susan can respond to you, Ashley.
I was just gonna say I don't understand why the government is so worried about immigration or immigrants because if you really look at history, we're all immigrants. We stole this land from the Native American Indians. Wow. And not only that, a lot of the people in the White House are immigrants themselves. So why are you worried about getting people that none of us really belong here?
Can't argue
Yeah,
with that.
And
yeah,
then they're also worried about criminals when the president is a criminal himself.
yeah.
Amen.
It makes no sense to me.
Exactly.
It's an oxymoron.
No, it's like an excellent point. Okay, I'm not seeing any other final questions. Can we get another final round of Zoom applause for Cade?
Thanks,
This is
guys.
amazing. As I noted, and we'll be sending out follow up with all the great resources that Kate spoke about.
Yeah, definitely. John, I'll send you something tomorrow.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds great.
Okay, perfect.